Welcome to The Explainer. You ever wonder what makes you fall for one person and not another? Is it really a conscious decision we make? Or is there something much, much deeper going on? Today, we're going to dig into the science that suggests our attractions are actually written into our biology long before we ever think about making a choice.
This quote from our source material really just puts it out there, doesn't it? It says, attraction isn't something we can just turn on and off. It's an involuntary experience, as fundamental as any other drive we have. So that's the big question, right? If it's this deeply ingrained, where does it actually come from? To figure that out, we're going to follow the biological breadcrumbs, from our genes to the womb and all the way into the complex wiring of our brains. Now, to really get why the science is so important, we have to start with the other side of the coin. For centuries, homosexuality wasn't seen as an orientation at all, but as a conscious choice, a lifestyle, or even a sin. And as you can imagine, this idea had absolutely devastating consequences. I mean, this timeline shows you the brutal reality. From the moment colonists arrived in places like Brazil, this idea of homosexuality as a nefarious sin was used to justify just horrific violence. And this thinking, that same-sex attraction was a sickness, continued for centuries, and its legacy, tragically, is still felt today. So, as science moved forward, the search for answers started to shift, away from morality and towards biology. And the very first place researchers looked for a simple answer to this really complex question, well, it was the obvious one, our DNA. You might remember this from the 1990s. The idea of a single gay gene made huge headlines. It was all over the news. But as it usually goes with science, the real story turned out to be way more complicated than that. And we know this because of one of the largest genetic studies ever done. Researchers from the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard looked at the DNA of nearly 500,000 people. And their conclusion was totally definitive. There is no single gene that determines your sexual orientation. So what did they find? Well, something much more complex. It turns out that thousands of different genetic variations, when you put them all together, account for only about 8 to 25% of the likelihood of same-sex behavior. So yeah, genetics plays a part, for sure, but it's nowhere near the whole story. And really, the lead geneticist on that huge study, Andrea Gana, put it perfectly. You just can't look at someone's DNA and predict their sexual orientation. It's impossible. Genetics is just one little piece of a much, much bigger biological puzzle. Okay, so if it's not just our DNA sequence, what else is going on? Well, a whole lot of research is pointing to a really critical period of time, the 9 months we spend in the womb before we're even born. And this is where we get into this super cool idea called epigenetics. Okay, so think of it like this. If your DNA is the instruction manual, epigenetics is like the set of highlighters and sticky notes that tell your body which instructions to actually read and which ones to kind of ignore. They're like dimmer switches for your genes, turning them up or down without changing the fundamental code. So how does this have anything to do with attraction? Well, one of the main theories is that some of these epigenetic switches can actually be passed down from a parent to their child. A father, for example, might pass an epimark to his daughter that changes how her developing brain responds to testosterone in the womb. It's not a massive change, but it could subtly tweak the specific neural circuits that have to do with attraction later in life. And you know, some of the best evidence for this comes from studying identical twins. Think about it. If sexual orientation was purely genetic, identical twins would match up 100% of the time, right? But they don't. In reality, they only match somewhere between 20 and 50% of the time. That gap is huge, and it's basically proof that other biological factors, like these epigenetic switches, have to be involved. And epigenetics isn't the only thing happening in the womb. Scientists have found another really fascinating clue, something called the fraternal birth order effect, which seems to influence sexual orientation in some men. Okay, this is known as the maternal immune hypothesis. Now, this sounds a little wild, but stick with me. The theory goes that with each son she has, a mother's immune system can get more sensitive to certain proteins that are only on the Y chromosome. Her antibodies might then cross the placenta in a later pregnancy and influence the brain development of that son. And what's really important here is that this is a purely biological mechanism. It has nothing to do with what it's like socially to grow up with older brothers. So we have this really complex mix of genes and prenatal factors that lay all the groundwork. But where do we see the results? Well, for that, let's look at the brain itself. In this amazing study from Sweden's Karolinska Institute, researchers found that the hypothalamus, which is a core part of the brain that regulates sexual behavior, it lights up based on sexual orientation, not biological sex. So the brains of gay men and straight women reacted in a similar way to male hormones. It's fascinating. And this fits perfectly with some groundbreaking research from the 90s by neuroscientist Simon LeVay. He found that a tiny little spot in that same part of the brain was, on average, smaller in gay men than in straight men. It was actually closer to the size typically found in women. Now, it's really important to be clear. This does not mean gay men have female brains. That's a huge oversimplification. It just means that these specific clusters of neurons directly linked to our sexual drive can have physical differences. And what about that obsessive, can't eat, can't sleep feeling when you're first falling for someone? Well, researchers in Italy found that people in that state have about 40% less serotonin, which is a calming neurotransmitter. And get this, that level is remarkably similar to what you find in people with obsessive-compulsive disorder. And the intensity doesn't stop there. Attraction also triggers a massive flood of dopamine in the brain's reward centers. As neuroscientist Renato Sabatini puts it, the brain mechanism is basically identical to getting addicted to a drug like cocaine. That incredible rush we feel, it is a powerful, totally involuntary biological response. All right, we've looked at genes, at epigenetics, the prenatal environment, the brain itself. After we weave all these different threads of evidence together, what's the picture that we're left with? I think the most important takeaway is this. Sexual orientation is not caused by any one single thing. It's the result of a complex dance between a whole bunch of factors. A little bit of genetics, the epigenetic switches that control those genes, the hormones in the womb, and other prenatal stuff. All of these elements come together to help shape our brains, making sexual orientation a completely natural and diverse part of human biology. And this science, it really reframes the whole conversation. It moves the issue away from being about choice or behavior or lifestyle, and it puts it firmly where it belongs, in the context of innate biology. Just as LeVay concluded, it's not about people acting inappropriately. It's about a natural variation within our species. And this brings us right back to where we started. We began by looking at the suffering caused by that simple but incredibly damaging idea that attraction is just a choice. But the science tells a very different story. It shows us that who we love is rooted so deeply in our biology. So the final question, the one we're left with, is this. How does that knowledge change not just our minds, but our hearts?